Good afternoon. This is Courtney Neubauer with the Division of Nutrition Support. We have over 100 participants so far on this training, so that makes me really excited. Hopefully, just about every SFA is covered. I think we're still missing some. We are going to be repeating this training on March 22nd at 1 o'clock. And this training is also being recorded and will be posted to Louisiana Fit Kids. So if you see some of your fellow child nutrition directors not on this call, please encourage them to listen to the recording or come back on March 22nd. March 22nd will be a repeat, but feel free to join a second time. A lot of this is going to be very new. So our process this year is very different than what it's been in the past. So I just want to make sure that everybody is aware of what's coming and the process before we get to April. So to start, we are going to go over some of the general guidance and background information about CEP. Also, where we're really going to focus is on the notification requirements and how eScholar CEP Manager is going to fulfill that role. And then we're also going to talk about how to ensure that all of our identified students are counted in CEP Manager. And some of the areas that we'll focus on will be the person matching and address matching, which is in eScholar, and also DSNAP. And then we'll close with just other CEP considerations. So to start, the current guidance and background information. The current guidance that we have is not really that current. A lot of it is from school year 16-17. The Community Eligibility Provision Planning and Implementation Guidance Manual is listed here and linked to that manual. We also have Memo SP 54-2016, which is from school year 2016. We also have the Eligibility Guidance Manual for school meals, which contains information about CEP. And then the annual notification and publication requirements, which is SP 20-2017. And all of these have live links. So once this is posted, you'll be able to reach all of those resources. Like I said, even though this is the most current resource, it is not really that new. So CEP, I'm going to go over just some of the general background on CEP, but I'm not going to focus on that because we have been doing CEP here in Louisiana for a good while. So some of the basic information I have left out of this training because I want to really focus on the eScholar CEP Manager. So CEP was established by the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act. It does operate on a 4-year cycle, but schools do have the ability to opt in or opt out each year based on the information from that school year. So they can opt in for the next year with the information from the previous year. So for right now, what we're gearing up to do is to opt in for CEP for school year 22-23, and we're going to be using the data from April of 2022. So students would receive free meals, and they have to be receiving meals under both breakfast and lunch. And alternative, you have to find there, this is an alternative to processing household meal applications for free and reduced price meals. So in CEP schools, they cannot process meal applications. So to participate in CEP, so before we can approve a school system, SFAs must agree to serve all children free breakfasts and lunches, to cover any additional costs above the reimbursement with non-federal funds, to not collect or process meal applications. They cannot be a residential child care institution. So any of our SFAs that are residential child care institutions are not eligible for CEP. And then the SFA, either by individual site or a cluster of sites, must have an enrollment with at least 40% of the students considered identified students to participate in CEP. And that information is determined by April 1st of the school year prior to participation. So we'll focus a little bit on this next slide about number 2. So what do we mean by non-federal funds? So if the reimbursement that you receive from the meals from USDA is not enough to cover your costs, then the remainder of the cost would have to be paid for with non-federal funds. And that could be profits from a la carte sales, profits from catering, any in-kind contributions, and then transfers from the general fund. So when we look at when you're not 100% free claiming for CEP and you would need to supplement with non-federal funds, these are the areas that we were talking about including. So once again, the eligibility to participate, you cannot be a residential childcare institution. The SFA by site or cluster of sites must have an enrollment with at least 40% of the students considered identified students. You must agree to serve both breakfast and lunch, and there still must be an accurate point of service where the meals are counted. So what are identified students? So identified students are our directly certified children and their siblings. And this is SNAP, which also includes disaster SNAP or DSNAP, and also TANF. Children who are identified as homeless, runaway, migrant. Also children that are enrolled in Head Start, children identified as foster children. And all of these students that are identified as identified students must be determined to meet one of these criteria by a means other than a meal application. And children must be considered eligible for one of these categories between the start of the school year and when that information is reported as of April 1st. So to determine school eligibility, we look at the combination of your SNAP children and their siblings, TANF students and their siblings, homeless, migrant, runaway, foster children, Head Start. And all of those students are added together for the count of identified students. Now, the count of identified students is slightly different from your students that may be considered free for economically disadvantaged. So if you look at this list and you think about some of, for some of you that are also in the data side of things, you'll see things like Medicaid are not included here. Students that are English language learners are not included here. And then we also have students that we can't count students who are identified as free by some kind of application or some kind of income survey. So it's very, very different in the fact that our categories for what counts as an identified student does not match the same as an economically disadvantaged count. So these are the groups of students listed here that are counted toward that identified student count. And that eligibility is determined on April 1st. So we look at one point in time as of April 1st to determine a school's eligibility for participation in CEP. So students in the same household with a directly certified student, so a student that's receiving SNAP or TANF, you can count other children in that household as identified students. So we consider that DC extension. So when you're extending the benefit of SNAP and TANF to other children in the household. You cannot use information from the free and reduced applications to identified students. So we're only identifying the kids that can be identified by some means other than an application. If a school or a group of schools has an identified student percentage of at least 62.5%, then all meals will be reimbursed at the free rate. If there's an identified student percentage between 40 and 62.5%, you can participate in CEP, but the meals will be reimbursed at both the free and the paid rate. So all students would eat for free, but the claim would consist of meals at both the free and the paid rate. So once we get those identified students, so those children that we've identified as identified students on the previous slide, we're going to look at that number divided by the total enrollment, which both the identified student count and the enrollment is as of April 1st. And that gives us the identified student percentage. So individual schools or a group of schools. So if one school has a percentage that's less than 40% and another school has a percentage that's much higher than 40%, when those schools are added together, if that overall percent is over 40%, then that group of schools is eligible for CEP. So individual schools or a group of schools must have an identified student percentage of 40% to be eligible for CEP. And once again, if you're trying to get to that magic number where all meals served are claimed at the free rate, that is 62.5%. So once we get that identified student percentage we did on the previous slide, we then multiply that percentage by the CEP multiplier. And that CEP multiplier, according to federal regulation, can vary, but it's currently set at 1.6 and has been set at 1.6 since the inception of CEP. So that identified student percentage times that CEP multiplier, which is currently 1.6, gives us the percent of meals that are claimed at the free rate. And I've included the calculated ISP as another term for this because this is a term that you've seen on the previous CEP worksheet and you'll also see in the new CEP manager system. So that's where that 62.5% of the magic number comes from. So with an identified student percentage of 62.5, when we multiply that times 1.6, that gives us 100% of the meals claimed at the free rate. So schools that do participate in CEP are still required to conduct a direct match, and that must occur at least once annually. So you were probably used to Jane reaching out to you if you haven't run that direct match, because it is still required of all school systems. And even this school year, where all of our schools are participating in the seamless summer option, or the majority of our schools are participating in the seamless summer option, the requirement to conduct a direct match is still there. So the reasons why USDA requires school systems, even when they are operating CEP, to conduct that direct match, is they can look at ways that they can possibly take advantage of ISP increases. So if you start seeing that the numbers are increasing, then you know that the next April, you're going to want to reestablish and start that 4-year cycle over. And it also gives you an opportunity to observe demographic trends. So if we start to see that that percentage decreases, you can start to make a plan, a long-range plan, when you get to the end of that 4-year cycle. And that's something that we've seen over the last few years. So we had a large influx of CEP after the flood of 2016. And we are now getting to the end of those 4-year cycles where school systems have had to look at the trends to determine what next steps they would need to make now that the numbers are very different than they were following that flood. So the majority of what we're going to talk about is the notification requirements and what's required of school systems when it comes to reporting for possible participation in CEP and also CEP elections. So our notification requirements that USDA has set for CEP are met by the completion of the population data form and the CEP worksheet. Previously, these forms have been housed in our child nutrition program website, and that required school systems to self-report data from each of those different categories that we mentioned earlier that were identified students. And sometimes that data was accurate, and sometimes we learn after the fact that it's not so accurate. And so we've been trying to come up with a solution that allowed for this data to be pulled from multiple sources where it's already being kept and put into one location that we can use to identify the true identified student count. And so it's been a multi-year project, but we have now developed and will be moving toward the CEP Manager portal, which is located in the eScholar Direct Match system. So the notification, which is met by these forms, the first form being the population data, it will notify you as a school district, as well as the state agency, as well as USDA, as well as all of the advocates that help support increasing these CEP numbers. It will notify you of the eligible districts, the school districts that are considered near eligible, the school districts that are participating in CEP, and those districts that are eligible for a grace year, or who are approaching that end of the 4-year cycle and may potentially have an additional year after that. So this reporting requirement, it has to be complete by April 15th. So the data is as of April 1st, and it has to be reported to us at the state agency by April 15th. It doesn't give you a lot of time. So completion of that population data form meets this requirement. It's a simple process. You're able to identify us of which schools are eligible for CEP, and we're also able to notify you of the district-wide eligibility for CEP. So that's the first report, the population data form, which is what we're gearing up to open for April 1st and will need to be completed by April 15th. So that form is required by all SFAs except for our residential childcare institutions, and that must be submitted by April 15th annually. So even school systems that may not be interested in participating in CEP, or maybe they don't even qualify for CEP, they must still report those numbers so we can determine if they are eligible. So by May 1st, we then have to turn around and take that list that was submitted and publish it on our website and send it to USDA. So this entire process of the date of which the students must be eligible, which is April 1st, and the deadline for SFAs to submit to us, and the deadline for us to report that and send it back to USDA is all a month. So this is a very, very, very quick process. Then once that notification requirement has been met of April 15th, there's a second requirement where school systems must make a CEP election. And those CEP elections must be made by June 30th. And those elections will start with the new school year, which begins on July 1. So what we've done in previous years is we've had this system in our child nutrition website. And like I mentioned earlier, it required self-reporting of data. So we have made some changes and we have moved this system to what is going to be called, or what is called, the eScholar CEP Manager. And this is where I hope that we're going to be able to spend most of our time. I do think this is where a lot of the questions are going to come in. And I think that there's also going to be some growing pains. So we all know that when change happens, it makes us all nervous. We know that this is going to be new. Is it going to run absolutely smoothly? I sure hope so. But at the same time, we know that there's always hiccups in the process as we move to something new. So this is going to be a learning process and we are going to get there, but I want you to know that we do know that this is new and that it's new information. So if you want to come back and listen again on March 22nd, feel free to. And if you have questions as we move through this, please put them in the chat box. If it's things that I'm not able to answer right away, we'll take those back and we'll get answers for those. But just, breathe, relax, listen to calming meditation music as we move into this next section. So what's new for 2022? So little catchy. Maybe it's a little bit of a rhyme to make you calm down a little bit as we move into something new. So before we start, make sure that you've reviewed the eScholar training that was conducted over the summer. And this is a direct match training for end users. It has an overview of the entire direct match system. There was pieces that were discussed about the CEP manager, but there's also a lot of other things that were included. And some of those are different aspects of the direct match system that I don't have time to go into today. And so I want some of those areas that I did not put into this PowerPoint, that you'll be able to refer to that for some of that information. So new this year, all of the identified students must be reported in the eScholar direct match system. And this is going to automatically feed into the new CEP manager system. So all of the information has to be housed in the direct match system to feed into that worksheet. So whereas in previous years, you've gone into the worksheet and you've said, I have 100 SNAP children, I have 5 TANF kids, and you've put that in SitebySite, you won't be doing that. The information will be pulling in from all of our sources and the direct match system, and will give you the numbers for each of your site. Before you panic, there are some ways around that on how to manually add students if it's not capturing everybody. But the goal is to have all of those identified students in eScholar. So the enrollment and the identified students should be up to date for that April 1 date, because that's the date that this data has to be accurate, and that's the date that we're using for eligibility. So it needs to be up to date for that date. So the population data form. So as a reminder, all SFAs, even those that don't intend to apply for CEP, with the one exception of our residential child care institutions, must submit the population data form in eScholar. This is due to us at the state agency by April 15th. And once again, new this year, all of the population data will automatically be pulled from the eScholar system, and SFAs will only have to confirm that the data is correct. So to start, where are you going to find this information? How are you getting into the eScholar system? So the eScholar direct match system, the login URL is located here. We've also posted a memo a few months back when that URL changed. There's probably staff members that hopefully already know how to get into direct match, but that's where the CEP manager is going to be located. So once you get to that URL, you'll have that box where you enter your email address and your password. Once you do that, it'll bring you into the eScholar system. If you have multiple eScholar applications, so maybe you have Person ID or some of the other programs, then you have this little waffle and you'd be able to get to the eScholar direct match system there. It'll automatically bring you to the home page, which is the little house. And that is the start of where we will go with the rest of this. The CEP manager icon is the abacus on the navigation panel. This icon will only appear if the user has rights to the CEP manager function within the security manager system. CEP manager allows the user to view, update, and certify both the population and the election data. So there is a question, right, about access to eScholar CEP manager. So we are setting up all of the authorized representatives. So usually that's the child nutrition director with access to CEP manager. There are a few situations that are a little bit more complicated, and we'll work through that as well. But the goal is to have the authorized representative to have access to CEP manager. From there, if it's determined that there's somebody else that you want to have access, that's something that will go through Jane to get additional access to there. But we at the state agency have an agreement with the school district, and that that school district has given the authority to the superintendent and the authorized rep. So we are going to give the CEP manager rights to that authorized representative. And Jane has listed her email address in the chat box if you if you need that as well. And so if there is somebody other than the authorized rep that needs access, you can contact her. So once you click on that abacus, there will be some instructions on the bottom of the CEP page. And this just tells you kind of that you must verify that we're going to verify and accept the data, and that it must be made prior to the deadline. So we'll have set all those deadlines in the background to where it's just automatically going to know the dates that this information is due by. So that is automatically set on the back end, and you would be able to submit that information. The population data tab, which is the first tab, displays the total identified, total enrolled, the district trend, so whether or not the district is seeing an increase or a decrease in that ISP, the population data status, so whether or not you've submitted that information, whether or not it's been accepted by the state agency, or whether it's been reopened. So in this particular instance, both the population data and the elections are due, and that this school system has not submitted either at this point. The locations and the pending data at the bottom are the information that needs to be submitted by the school system. You can click to see the data for each individual school. So in this case, we're going to look at the first school, which is school code 34570, which is the CEP testing school. And this particular school has 3 identified students and an enrollment of 10. So the ISP for this particular school is 30%, and the status of whether or not that information has been submitted is currently pending. So you would click on the 2 little arrows that are facing to the right to go to the next, to drill down into that particular site. So once you drill down into the next site, you can view the students by program. So the student ID is listed there. So your student ID that you've assigned to that student is listed there, as well as the school code where this student is enrolled. And then it will show you which program this child has been identified under. A green triangle indicates that this child was a manual match. So the school system manually made that match in EScholar. If there is a circle, which there isn't on this page, but it shows at the bottom, that is a system match. So all of those SNAP matches that you already do through direct match, those would appear as circles. And so that means the system has already matched that. So as an auditor, or us at the state agency, we're going to focus on those triangles because those are the ones that you've made the update on, and may require a little bit more digging during an administrative review. So you can verify this information. Do know it is possible for one student to be identified under different areas. So if this child was a SNAP child, but also a foster child, there may be an indicator under both of those headings. But that child will only be counted one time in the identified student count at the top. So don't panic if you see that one child has different categories that they're identified under, that the system is smart enough to know that that child can only be counted one time in that identified student count. So once you look at this information, you can click on those arrows at the top, the ones that point to the left, and that'll take you back to the previous page. So once you've gone through all of your sites and you can determine whether or not this information looks correct, then you can certify and submit. If the information does not look correct, please don't certify and submit. We do have the ability to reopen this, but this is intended to be a certification that you've looked at this, that the information is correct. So please don't certify and submit until you're sure that the information is as it should be. You also have the ability to go back in previous years. So these headings in the middle of the screen with the different years does allow you to look at the CEP data from the last 4 school years. Do know that as we've progressed over the last few years, we have changed our processes. So when we began this, we did not identify students down to each of the different identified student categories. So we've lumped them into kind of broader categories. So those previous years are going to look a little bit different. So you're not going to see the same breakdown of Even Start and DC Extended and foster, homeless, migrant. There were kind of buckets where some of these children were counted in the same group. And you probably remember that from previous year, that we did SNAP and DC Extended together. We had TANF, we had homeless, migrant, runaway as one group, and then we had Head Start as a different. So as we've progressed over the years, we've changed our processes. So when you look at the previous years, you'll notice that the data is kind of categorized a little bit differently. So once you have finished and reviewed your system and all the data is correct, you can submit. And once you submit, we have to approve that submission or accept that submission. So once you submit that, it comes to us at the state agency, and we will look over that. And we will then mark accept, and that information will then allow, once we have accepted, then you are able to go into the elections tab. So until your data on the population data page has been accepted, you will not be able to proceed to the elections page. So once we've approved it, you'll see that the accepted status will change. So it now shows that the population status has been accepted. So you met the timeline, it's now accepted, and you can move on to the elections tab. So once you move on to the elections tab, you can view the detailed elections by location name. You'll see the total identified, the total enrolled, the identified student percentage, the calculated identified student percentage. So that's that identified student percentage times that multiplier. So in this case, it's that identified student times the 1.6, which gives us the calculated ISP or the free claiming percentage. And then you can see if the school system has been participating in CEP, or if it's newly participating in CEP. A green indicator on the left-hand side shows that that school or school system, the cluster or the school is eligible for CEP. If it's red, then it shows it's not eligible, and if it's yellow, then it's in the nearly eligible group. Okay, so we're now going to just look a little bit more into this first line of the elections tab. So the identified student percentage, as we've mentioned already, is the proportion of students who are directly certified or categorically eligible for free meals, and that's through some means other than an application, and they're not subject to verification. So once again, that total identified students is the count as of April 1st, and that's divided by the total enrollment on April 1st, which gives us the identified student percentage. So in this particular case, in cluster 1, there's 9 identified students with an enrollment of 20, which gives us an identified student percentage of 45%. So you'll see that the first location is cluster 1. And so there are 3 sites in cluster 1. And so you may be wondering how you're going to see those sites, and we're going to get to that in just a moment. There's also some questions going on in the chat box about how we can update data in direct match. And so don't panic. That's the next section that we're going to go over, is how we make sure all the numbers are there. So that will be coming in just a second. Okay, so once again, that calculated ISP is used to determine the federal reimbursement. So the identified student percentage is multiplied by that CEP multiplier, which is currently 1.6, and that provides the calculated identified student percentage, which is the percentage of meals that are claimed at the free rate. So grouping or clustering is a flexible characteristic of CEP that allows you to maximize the federal reimbursement and administrative efficiencies. So SFAs can, they have the discretion on how they want to cluster schools to optimize the CEP benefits. So we've seen clustering of a certain area of a parish. We've seen clustering of just the highest percentage schools. We've seen multiple different combinations, but the goal of clustering is that when there are schools that sometimes are not as high as of an ISP, so maybe they're below 40%, and then there's others that are much higher, you're able to cluster those together, and you're able to see that the overall identified students divided by the total enrollment is over 40%, and that entire cluster can participate in CEP. So if you're wanting to drill down and see which schools are included in that cluster 1, you would then click the double arrow and it'll drill down to those details. So on this screen, you can see the election details by program. So here we're looking at, in our schools, we have testing site 1 and testing site 3 that are in our group. So in this particular cluster, we have 2 sites, and the total for that cluster is 6 identified students, and our total enrollment is 11. Tells us what our percentage our ISP is, the calculated ISP. And then you can then look down at the bottom and see the totals for those particular programs and also the school in which they are assigned. So you can see that the first 4 students listed here have a school code of 3298, which is our testing site number 1. And then the bottom 2 are identified students that are in our testing site number 3. You can also see that the majority of our students were identified through a manual match, and those are notated by the triangles. And we do have 1 child that was identified as migrant through a system match. So the question may be, where's all this information coming from? And a lot of it is coming from programs that are already in use within the state. So, you know, foster children are already being reported on a higher level within the Department of Education. Migrant students are being reported by the districts to another system. And so being able to pull that information in to accurately report these children in CEP Manager will hopefully save you time and energy of trying to track down the list of these children that may be much harder to get. You'll see that there is a larger white place on this screen, and that is because next year, not this year, but next year, when we do this in April of 2023, we will be able to use Medicaid data because we are part of that demonstration project. And so that information will also be used in here, but that is for April of 2023, so not now. Okay, so this next page, you can click the refresh and that will refresh the data. So if you may have gone in and made some manual updates to some of those children and you want to just pull in the most accurate data because you've made some changes, you can refresh, it'll pull in all the data, and that number potentially could change just depending on what changes were made into the system. So you can always refresh the data by clicking the refresh button. You can also view the details for the elections, which we've already looked at, by clicking those double arrows, and this would bring you into the drill down for cluster 1. So here, once again, the 2 double arrows, you'll come in, we've already looked at this site as well, that shows that you can drill down, see the program types, and the cluster information, and can determine if this site is eligible for CEP and what it's participating in for this particular cluster, and all of the students that are contributing to that identified student. And then you can click that arrow at the top, the double arrow, to return back to your elections page. So if you look over this information and you see, okay, the sites that were in cluster 1, I really would like to make some changes. I want to be able to add some of these other sites in to the cluster. You can click the recalculate button, and that allows you to rework the clusters, to rework the CEP data, and to make any changes that you need to elections for going forward. So when you click that recalculate button, the recalculation page will appear. This allows the user to if they want to, click that district-wide button. So if the ISP is high enough, it will allow you to select that button. If the identified student percentage is not high enough, it will be grayed out. You then can set up each site site by site for which clusters you want to add it to. So if you want to put all sites in cluster 1, you would then put cluster 1 for all of them, and then you'll be able to save that. Okay, the drop down allows for you to set up the site by site participation and the clusters. The individual participation and the not participating are choices that you would make for individual schools. If you're wanting a site to participate in CEP as part of a cluster, you'll start with cluster 1, cluster 2. I know the majority of the sites, I think the max we've seen is probably 3, but you can put them all in one cluster, you can put them in multiple clusters, it's totally up to you. But individual participation and non-participating is for individual sites. You want to use those determinations just for those, and then clusters if you're doing any kind of group of sites. So the clusters can be assigned on this page, and you can choose cluster 1 followed by cluster 2, cluster 3. You just continue to use them in sequence. This is not something that we've seen to be a problem, but our goal is to fill cluster 1 before we move to cluster 2, and keep in that sequential order. Okay, so this is, that's the end of kind of the CEP manager. Okay, and a lot of it, hopefully it looks somewhat similar to what you've seen when it was on the CMP website. So the headings may look a little bit newer, a little bit updated, but the data should look pretty similar. So the process is not highly changed from what we've done before. It's in a new location and the data is automatically being pulled in, but the election process looks fairly similar to what it has been in the past. So we've gotten a lot of questions of people wondering, how do we make sure that all those identified students are there? How do we make sure that we haven't missed somebody? So that's what I'm going to focus on for the next few minutes, is how do we ensure that all of our identified students are captured? So some of the ways that we're going to do that is through person ID or person matching, the matching options, which we're going to talk about in just a second. DSNAP, which I think I've already seen a question about DSNAP come in. Y'all are beating me to it. And then the third is address matching. So first, person matching. So this is something you're probably used to seeing. So this is not something that that has been heavily changed on the person matching page. This is where you are the navigation bar, and you click on the check mark, which takes you to this match options page. This is where we have person ID, the upload file, individual matches, and manual authorization. So person ID is the first place you start. So this is the match that occurs monthly. So you're using the person ID for that match. So sometimes it's a state initiated match, but the school system also has the ability to match themselves. So person ID uses that secure ID data. So all the students that have a secure ID, and it matches against the program data. And that's number one. So here you're able to match for SNAP, also match for TANF, and you can click match. So that's the number one area where the majority of your students through direct match are going to come from. So once your person ID match has happened, you can download the file. This is not new, so this process is hopefully very familiar to you, but this is where the majority of the data is going to come from. So how do we make sure that we're getting our eScholar direct match counts where they should be? You should resubmit any current students to unique ID to make sure that they do have an ID assigned to them. And you want to claim that master record. So you're going to run direct match for both SNAP and TANF. The direct match uses the master record in unique ID and matches that against SNAP and TANF. So there are history records in there as well, and those are not used in direct match. So only one school system can have one student. So that master record is what is going to be used. So we don't want a child that may have moved maybe a few times throughout the year and being matched in multiple locations. We want that child to be matched where they're located on April 1. So that school system needs to hold that master record to properly identify that child. You also want to resolve all of your near matches. The search function, which is that magnifying glass with the plus sign in eScholar, this will give you a complete list of all the students who've matched to the SNAP file from the start of the school year until the last time the direct match was run. So that is the file that used to be considered my students. It's now located in that search function. So that's the first part. So where the majority of the students are going to come from is from person ID. So the process you're doing on a monthly basis where you're running the match or the state is initiating the match and you are resolving those near matches, and that is the heart of the identified students. We also have the other areas that I'm not going to touch on, which is the upload the file and individual match. So before we moved all of our school systems to using unique ID, there was the ability, or still is the ability, to upload the file, but the way CEP Manager works, the student needs to have a unique ID. So person ID is going to be where you want to start. You can individually match individual students, but if you're updating that file right before April 1st, then there's no need to use that individual match for this process. But this fourth section, the manual match, this is where this is going to be pretty useful for you. So the manual authorization, this allows the user to manually add a student to a specific program. And you can do that through manual authorization. So the user can enter the student secure ID and then click match. So here you'll see that the student ID matches me. So I currently live on Pike Street in Youngsville, and this is the district and the school that I attend. And the school system is wanting to add an additional flag to my record. So they would click the edit button in the far right corner. From there, you can add a new program. So just click the add new program. The school system has determined that they're going to add homeless as a flag for this student. The manual match eligibility is listed based on the individual user roles. So depending on the user roles, determine what programs you would see. So you wouldn't see Medicaid here because we're not able to match to Medicaid in Louisiana at this time. From there, you would add a start date and a match reason. So here I'm now homeless effective May 28th. And it's because I lost my apartment and I'm now living on the sofa of a relative or something. So here I no longer have my place of living. And so I'm now have a homeless flag that's also linked to me. And that is now, we're then going to click update. And that additional flag of homeless will now be linked to me as well. So here you'll see that for my record, I now have a flag, a manual match flag of homeless, and there's the comment and the start date. So this is going to be really helpful for matching students that we're not able to capture through the direct match system because they may be a sibling. And they're not only a sibling, but the addresses don't match. So we're going to also talk about address matching in just a second. But if addresses don't match, and because maybe the family has moved 3 or 4 times since their SNAP record, then they may not connect those 2 siblings. So this may be an option for you to manually make those updates when mom calls and says, hey, so-and-so is free, but now my other child who also attends school in your district is paying, but they're both my children. So it allows you to go in there and make those change for that particular child. So the next question is DSNAP or disaster SNAP. So DSNAP eligible households are considered directly certified, just as any other SNAP eligible child. So DSNAP is considered exactly the same as regular SNAP. Now, P-SNAP or pandemic SNAP is not considered the same thing. So children eligible for P-SNAP or pandemic SNAP are not going to be included as identified students unless they met one of those other criteria. But DSNAP or disaster SNAP can qualify for directly certified. So we had a pretty big hurricane this year. So there are probably a large number of children who were eligible for DSNAP across the state. So We are working on a long-term fix to have DSNAP be a match type in eScholar Direct Match, but unfortunately, we're not there yet. So in the meantime, for this school year, you can use your economically disadvantaged file and pull out the DSNAP children only and update that child's status based on that information. So we have trained you really well to not use that economically disadvantaged file, because we know that there are children on that file that are not considered identified students. But in this instance, where this is the only place that the DSNAP students are located, you will want to use your economically disadvantaged file to manually update those children that received DSNAP. Okay, so the next option, which is the match option for address, and hopefully this address matching will catch the majority of your DC extension. So that's the goal, is that this address matching could really capture the majority of those. So address matching is located in the same spot as person matching. You'll just click the address tab. From there, the system will compare addresses of students that are in person ID, so students that are have unique IDs, and they're going to compare that to the addresses of students in state programs such as SNAP. So there is the ability for school systems to run this match individually, and we also have the ability to start a state batch. And so right now we have started a state batch for this. So the match has already been run, and the address matches are now waiting to for near matches to be checked. So here you'll see that it's pulled up some addresses. And so it's looking at addresses that were that an eligible child. So there was a child living at 40 Cass Road in Youngsville that qualified for a benefit. But there's also another child that lives at 40 Cass Road with an E who was not identified. So the question is whether or not these children, this is the same family, or if these are two separate families. So you can drill down on the student information by that down arrow, and you can look to see some more information. So here you'll see that the eligible address of 40 Cass Road and the match address of 40 Cass Road with an E, but has a different spelling, and the city, state, and zip are all the same. So this is most likely the same address. Okay. You then can look and see that the identified student that was at the eligible address was once again me. And you'll see that the student that is currently not at the match address is my husband. So I can look at that and see that those are the exact same last names. They're in the same district. They're at different schools, and they're different information, but the addresses are pretty much exact. So one's with an E and one's without an E, and the children have the same last name. They live in the same school system. So the chances of this being a match, of these two children being related, is pretty high. So if that's the case, you can click the match button or the check. If there were multiple students, so if my name was listed in this top section for identified students at the eligible address, and then there were more people, so maybe there was another child listed here at the bottom, and maybe that child had the same last name, you could click that checkbox at the top, and it would match both of those students to me. Or you can look at them each individually, and you can mark the check next to the child's name itself, and it would match just that one student. If you determine that these addresses are truly not the same, so this is not the same child, there's no way these people are related, Or maybe you know this address of being an apartment complex. And so there's numerous apartments in here, and these two children have very different last names, and you're not able to make a connection. You can then mark no match, and you can do no match for if there was a list of students at this address, or no match for each individual student. Okay, I have included Jane's contact information. Please don't bombard her at this point. I know there's a lot of questions. I've also included a link to the EScholar user manual. So timeline of when this information is going to be due. So April 1st is when the population data will open. It is due by April 15th. You then can make CEP elections, but they cannot be made until the population data submission has been accepted by the state agency. So that more than likely will not be until after that April 15th date. We'll send our report to USDA on May 1st. June 30th is the deadline for making elections, and then the elections begin on July 1, and the form will be locked. Other CEP considerations. So anytime there's a change in student population that impacts the identified students or the enrollment, the school or group of schools participating in CEP must recalculate. If a new school wants to participate in CEP, it is possible, but they must have the identified student number and the total enrollment before the counting and claiming of meals begins. And the deadline for election is exactly the same, so it's still June 30th. If a school system wants to opt out of CEP, that is absolutely okay. They can notify LDOE of that decision and notify the households of the decision as well, and allow ample time for the submission of free and reduced meal applications. School systems must offer all students reimbursable free meals for a period of at least 30 operating days following the date of restoration of standard procedures, or until a new eligibility determination is made, whichever comes first. If at the end of the CEP 4-year cycle, the school system must reestablish their identified student percentage. If you no longer meet the 40% eligibility threshold, but there's an ISP of at least 30%, the school system can continue to operate community eligibility for 1 additional year, and that's called the grace year. The percentage of the meals reimbursed at the free rate during that grace year is based on the lower new ISP. Carryover eligibility. So if a school system, they must carry over a status from a CEP school to a non-CEP school for the first 30 operating days, or until a new eligibility can be determined. If a child is transferring between schools, if they're going from a non-CEP to a CEP school, they receive free meals. If they're going from a CEP school to a non-CEP school, they must be provided free meals for up to 10 operating days until a new determination can be made. So depending on whether or not the child is moving from a non-CEP to a CEP, or a CEP to a non-CEP, would determine how many how that child would be provided meals. So we are required at the state agency to ensure CEP accuracy. So part of the process, we are responsible for ensuring that you meet the criteria. And so part of our ways to ensure this is to have all of this data pulled from sources within our reach. So we're able to use a system called Merrill, which is where migrant data is housed. So that's kind of the source of the migrant data. So we're able to pull from all of these sources that are already being reported to the school system and are to the state and are being housed in a central location. We are able to pull from that to feed into the EScholar system. So it basically will run through EdLink to get there, but it basically from the reporting system that the school system already reports to for that particular program. We are also required to review 10% of the CEP data. And so that makes this a lot easier. So we can focus our 10% on the triangles or the ones that are manually matched. So that's something that, that we're able to easily do with this new system. As a reminder, CEP school systems that are operating CEP district-wide do not need to complete the paid lunch equity tool. If you are a CEP and non-CEP school system, then you only need to complete the tool for the non-CEP schools. Same thing for meal charge policy. If you're system-wide CEP, then there's no need to have a meal charge policy. If the school system operates some schools that are traditional counting and claiming, then you must have a meal charge policy for those schools. Verification is not required if you're participating in CEP, but you do still have to complete the verification summary form. And income surveys. So I saved the best for last. So I know many of our CEP school systems do use an income survey. So this is an alternative procedure to determine economic status of individual students, since you're not allowed to have free and reduced meal applications in CEP schools. So without those applications, you may not be capturing children that are considered economically disadvantaged based on income. So you can implement an income survey to survey those particular students. And the goal is to accurately identify those students for economically disadvantaged. So this survey is not a meal application, and any costs associated with processing these applications cannot be charged to the nonprofit school food service account. And once again, students that are identified as economically disadvantaged on income surveys are not considered identified students for CEP. Record keeping. Just a reminder that you must retain records that are used for the development of the ISP during the entire period that CEP is in effect. The records for the initial approval year and all records from any updates. And the documentation must be retained for 3 years after the submission of the final claim for reimbursement. So the positive thing is that all of this data in eScholar is your backup. So the main source of backup that you may have to keep outside of that is like for this year, maybe your DSNAP list, or if you updated some manual matches because they were a sibling, having the ability to look in your food service software or your enrollment software to see how you determine that those children are linked. I do encourage you to, if you do any manual matches, to include a comment so that down the road you're able to figure out kind of what those, how you made those decisions. If you have any questions, you can contact us. You can email our email address at childnutritionprograms@la.gov. You can also call us at 342-9661. I know there's a good bit of questions that have come in, so I'm going to try to see if I can answer any of them. I think some of them I already have. I think a lot of them were about the DC extended and all that before I actually got to talk about that. These slides will be posted to Louisiana Fit Kids as well as this recording. There's a question about where to get the DSNAP economically disadvantaged file. So it's the entire economic disadvantage file. You should be able to get, your data coordinator should be able to either pull just the DSNAP kids and provide that to you, or provide the list to you. If you're a non-public system, I saw that that question had come up. We are going to have a process through an FTP site to get that file to you. So I promise you, we did not forget about you. Let's see. Some of these questions I am going to take back. So at this time, we are at the state at LDOE running the address matching for you. So at this time, we have not given you access to address matching, but that is something that in the future may or may not be provided to you. But at this time, we plan on running the address matches monthly when the SNAP and TANF file are run. So you'll be able to match those near matches through address once a month as well. All right. Yes, if you're trying to get in now to the CEP manager and you can't see any information on your district, it's because it's not open yet. So until April 1st, when it's pulling that data, it will not let you refresh to get that. I'll look in and I may be able to look and see if I can get it to at least open before then, just so you can get an idea of what the numbers are. Let me look at that and see if that's something I can figure out. CEP manager, you should, as the authorized rep, be given access to that. If you need to contact Jane, her email address was on one of the previous slides. It's also in the chat box. So if you want to reach out to her and you haven't, that would be the best place to start. A lot of these other questions I am going to take back and get with the rest of our team to make sure that I answer them correctly. And we will post those answers as well, so that you do have access to that. Once again, we will repeat this training on March 22nd. This has also been recorded. The slides and the recording will be posted to Louisiana Fit Kids. Give it a few days for that to be posted. In the meantime, if you have any questions or concerns, reach out to me, or you can reach out to Jane. If you want to come back and listen again on March 22nd, please do so. And until then, I hope this hasn't caused you a whole lot of stress, and I hope that this is going to be really great for all of our numbers. It's going to help with the tracking, and hopefully it'll make your jobs a little bit easier. I know that it becomes very difficult to track down some of these backup documentation for programs like foster, migrant, homeless. So being able to pull this information from systems that are already reporting to the state, and then just having it feed into the system is going to be really, really beneficial. So once again, thank you for coming. I'm sorry I've held y'all over an hour. I seem to talk a lot. If you have any questions, reach out to us, and we'll talk to you again soon.